Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
Well, from the easily accessible online material which lured the Finsbury Park killer to the dangers posed by predators, the world of social media is changing so rapidly it's leaving government and regulators struggling to catch up. Today, a leading children's charity criticised ministers for failing to carry out half of its recommendations to improve online safety for children, a decade after they were published. And, says the NSPCC, many of the changes which have been made are already out of date. Fatima Manji reports.
Even a high-energy dance class can't keep these teenagers in Teesside away from their phones for long.
Oh my God, if I lost it, I'd cry. I wouldn't survive. I don't know what I'd do without the phone. Like when I dropped it down the toilet, I was gone. I didn't know how to live.
But if life is for living, on Snapchat or Instagram, do they know what to do if confronted with something dangerous online?
Just delete them and block them. I'm dead open with my mum. These might not be, but I'll talk to my mum about anything.
Scared, because if they can text you, obviously they can see this can see stuff. Then I'll just block them and never talk to them again.
It depends. Say I get a weird message or something, then I won't. But if it's only people I know, which it is, then I feel alright.
Because my mums want cool kids, but some people's parents might not be. My mum's one of the cool kids though.
So if you're not a cool kid like Leah's mum, how can you make sure your children are safe online? The NSPCC says it's not just about parenting, it's social media companies that should be more responsible. And it's the government's job to make that happen. 10 years ago, Professor Tanya Byron was commissioned by then Prime Minister Gordon Brown to report on children's online safety. Since then, she says the government's dragging its feet, ignoring or failing to implement many of her recommendations.
How many more children have to be groomed and murdered for us to go, you know what, this is serious, as it would be in the offline world. In the online world, we need laws, we need regulation.
No one would argue against trying to protect children, but there are concerns policing social media could risk censorship.
Toy manufacturers have to create toys. You know, we buy toys, there are regulations, it doesn't stifle innovation, it doesn't stop creativity. Censorship should be absolutely thought about and all of that stuff, but we also, particularly children, have the right to be safe.
The NSPCC want a mandatory code with an independent regulator who can fine social networks if they don't act quickly enough on child safety issues. But the online landscape changes fast, and the Byron report doesn't even cover some of the issues children face today. Instagram, Snapchat and WhatsApp didn't exist 10 years ago. Now 83% of 12 to 15-year-olds have a smartphone, and half of all children have a social media profile by the age of 12. The government says it's clear social media companies must go further and faster in reducing risks to children, and that it's considering changes to the law where necessary. In the meantime, over to the girls in Teesside for some words of wisdom.
I know how to deal with it, block them, report them.
I don't think little kids, about 10-year-olds, should have Snapchat or whatever.
If someone's messaging you that you don't know them, and then definitely tell someone about it.
Fatima Manji reporting.
Now, the NSPCC is accusing the government of dragging its feet when it comes to child online safety. The children's charity claims more than half of the 38 recommendations made by the landmark Byron report over a decade ago have not been implemented. Well, joining us from central London is Head of Child Online Safety at the NSPCC, Tony Stour. Welcome to you. Thank you very much for joining us, Tony Stour. Dr. Tanya Byron was actually on media outlets this morning also saying that the recommendations that she made in her report 10 years ago had nobody done anything with them. That is something that you agree with. Can you just remind us what those recommendations were a decade ago?
So when Professor Byron was asked by the government to look at all of this, she came up with a series of 38 recommendations that asked the government to set up a voluntary code for social networking sites to work together to protect children, that asked gaming networks and those kind of sites to work together with parents to understand what the risks were, and a variety of other of these kind of measures. What we found, having looked at this all again, is that only about half of those have been implemented. About half of them have just been totally ignored, or and so now out of date because the technology has moved on. It's clear that the most important measure, which would require the social networking sites to work together to put the protection of children right at the forefront of their work, was totally ignored by the government. They're only just starting to even think about it. They've really dragged their feet, and now is the time for them to take action.
What specifically was that recommendation, and how easy is it to implement?
So what Professor Byron recommended 10 years ago was that the government should come up with a voluntary code for the social networking sites to work together to put in place really strong parental controls that would protect children on all of the networks that they used. Now, of course, in those 10 years, technology has moved on. Many of the sites that children and young people use nowadays simply didn't exist then, such as Instagram and Twitter. But crucially, the government ignored that recommendation, the government of the day. All subsequent governments have, and the voluntary code that the government, the report recommended 10 years ago, is now clearly out of date. What we need now is, instead of mandatory code that would require these sites to take action from the very first moment. What's the difference there, of course, is that the self-regulation model that's existed for 10 years just hasn't worked. What we've seen is that children are continuing to be put at risk by using these sites. And indeed, in the first 6 months of the operation of this new grooming offence that we pushed for last year, we found 1,300 offences just in England, and most of those were on the top 3 sites that children use.
Now, the Prime Minister is talking tough about cracking down on some of these internet giants. Why is it so difficult to achieve what you're describing?
Well, I think if we continue to ask the social network sites just to work together, that simply isn't good enough. What we instead need is a regulator with the power to force them to take action. We see this in other countries like France and Germany, where there's a very clear expectation that all of these sites will take down extremist and anti-Semitic material. We need to imbue the sites with that same kind of pressure in the UK to make sure that child protection is essential, and if they don't take action, they must be fined. There must be real consequences for them. Having them marking their own homework just hasn't worked to protect children.
Isn't the other side of this argument really, we need to look at sort of social norms and parenting? Because you could ask, you know, what are 6-year-olds doing with access to the internet in the first place, many of whom have their own devices?
You're absolutely right that children use the internet in a huge variety of ways that we had no idea about. Actually, parents and children need to work together to understand what the risks and benefits of using the internet are. We've got loads of advice about that on our website. They can go to nspcc.org.uk, find out about the sites and apps that their children are using, and understand how to take action and set those parental controls. But it shouldn't be left to parents. The sites and apps should be essentially safe for every child from the first moment they go on. It's not okay to wait and expect parents and children to take the risks.
I'm just reading in the actual report itself, it says only just over 1/3 of children use child-friendly YouTube Kids platform. I've got 3 children, I didn't know that existed. I mean, there's a sort of publicity issue here, isn't there?
Well, and some of these sites have taken action and introduced things like YouTube Kids, but we know actually there's always an afterthought. It's not built into the sites from the very beginning that these operations start. And you're right, the controls aren't publicised well enough, and they're not set crucially by default. So one of the elements of the code that we're asking for would be for accounts that are used by under 18s should be automatically safe. That means they shouldn't be able to live stream to anyone except their friends. They should have their geolocation turned off, and their privacy controls should be set to the highest possible state. That's really crucial so that children can know that they're going to be safe on all of the social networking sites, not just on the ones that have made special provision.
OK, Tony Starr from the NSPCC, thank you.